Hello, I'm Dr. Anthony Clark, and I'm a professor of Chinese history, and I specialize in the history of Catholic Christianity in China. This series is about the Catholic martyr saints of China who died in a place that is often called in Asia as the Middle Kingdom. One of the sad ironies of history is that to discuss the past, we must have records or artifacts that tell us what happened. We cannot discuss what we do not know about. Aristotle wrote that if you would understand anything, observe its beginning and its development. Well, I completely agree with Aristotle, but unfortunately, we have far fewer sources about the Chinese who died in China than we have about the Western missionaries who died there. It is difficult to observe the beginning and development of China's history of Chinese saints since written records about them are scant. This is partially because Western missionaries kept more careful diaries about themselves and other Westerners than they did about Chinese. And it is also partially due to the fact that so many Chinese records about Christianity in the Middle Kingdom were deliberately destroyed during the Maoist Cultural Revolution. But in the end, we do have some precious accounts of Chinese Christians who died for God on their native soil. And it is to those holy men and women that we have dedicated this episode. Pope John Paul II once said in a homily that the blood of St. Peter is the foundation of the Church of Rome. And this is true. It is also true that the blood of Chinese Christians is the foundation of the Church in China. When Pope John Paul II canonized the 120 martyr saints of China in 2000, he canonized 87 Chinese and only 33 foreign missionaries. I have to admit here that I am guilty of a slight unfairness in this series, for I've only spoken mostly of foreign missionaries who died the deaths of martyrs. The great majority of China's saints are Chinese. I have done this quite consciously, but only because I have worked with very limited records about the Chinese martyrs who now enjoy God's face in heaven. Perhaps more documents will arise and other programs can be produced to give these blessed saints the exposure their sacrifices cry out for. In this episode, I will focus on the lives of 3 Chinese martyr saints whose personal stories stand as excellent examples of the other 84 canonized Chinese saints in the Catholic Church. I shall be looking at Saints Augustine Zhaorong, Thaddeus Liu Reiting, and Xi Zhuzi. The Church's official Memorial Day for the Martyr Saints of China is celebrated on July 9th, and it is listed in the calendar as Augustine Zhaorong and Companions. In fact, Saint Zhaorong is perhaps the most discussed native Chinese saint in the Catholic Church, and Pope John Paul II referred to him as one of China's proto-martyrs because he was killed more than 80 years before the Christian massacres of the Boxer Uprising in 1900. Zhaorong was born a non-Christian in the poor province of Guizhou in 1746, and he later took the name Augustine after he was baptized. One of the colorful aspects of Augustine's personality is that he was known to have lived a very self-indulgent life before he became a Christian, and he was still a bit, hot-headed after his conversion. Perhaps this is why he chose the name Augustine, after St. Augustine of Hippo, who we know lived an immoral life before his conversion to the Catholic faith. Zhaorong was hired as a runner for the local jail when he was 20 years old, and like St. Paul, he participated in the persecution of Christians before his conversion to Christianity. By 1772, the number of Christian converts in Guizhou was rising quickly, and local officials began to implement several anti-Christian policies. It was part of Zhaorong's job to participate in court-ordered persecutions against Catholic missionaries. In 1774, the French priest and member of the Paris Foreign Mission Society, Father Jean-Martin Moy, was arrested and imprisoned in the Wuchuan jail where Zhao Rong was employed. It was providence. Moy was a brilliant intellectual and gifted at explaining the Christian faith to non-believers. So, Zhao Rong, Father Moy's jailer, was converted to Christianity after long discussions in Moy's small jail cell. By the time of Moy's release, the two men had become very close friends, and Zhao walked several miles with him on the day of his discharge, discussing Christian doctrine. It is actually a bit tragic that Father Moy later returned to France, where he suffered even more terrible persecutions in his native country during the horrors of the French Revolution. And Zhao Rong eventually suffered under anti-Christian persecutions in the Middle Kingdom. Christ had warned his disciples that this would be part of being a Christian. "Men will hate you because of me," Jesus said. Father Jean-Martin baptized Zhao on the feast of St. Augustine, August 28, 1776. And even after his conversion, he remained to some extent, hot-tempered. We might even say that he was overly aggressive toward non-Christian religions. On one occasion, Augustine entered a local temple quite suddenly and attacked the clay statue of one of the deities. The monks were afraid to intervene because he was, after all, an employee of the local jail. Well, I need not say that this didn't help the reputation of Christians any. It is sometimes, good for us to learn that even the saints can be all too human at times. But despite his impetuousness, Zhao Rong was a tireless worker for the Christian mission in China, and Father Moy assigned him to several pastoral duties, and even taught him Latin and theology to encourage a vocation to the priesthood. A vicious plague struck Sichuan in 1779, and Zhao Rong was asked to baptize the infants that were found in large numbers left on the streets to die. Augustine exhausted himself with endless acts of charity in baptizing the poor little victims of the plague. He had grown in wisdom and holiness through this experience, and Augustine was made Father Augustine on May 10, 1781. Being Chinese, Zhao Rong was able to navigate through China with much more ease than foreign missionaries. He was entirely inconspicuous as he traveled to remote villages where he would preach, teach catechism, and administer the sacraments. The success of his ministry spoke loudly to church authorities, who still wondered if encouraging a native clergy in China was a good idea. Father Augustine went to Yunnan to work among the Yunnanese Aboriginal people in the highlands, and he was finally assigned to pastoral duties with the scattered Catholic communities of western Sichuan. It was not until he was settled in Sichuan that Zhao encountered serious difficulties. In 1815, inaugurated a protracted and severe anti-Catholic purge that swept forcefully through his region. Father Augustine was determined to remain with his Christians in spite of continued recommendations that he escape these dangers and flee from Sichuan. Like so many other priests who lived in China during the 1815 anti-Christian purges, Zhao Rong was forced to hide during the days and maintain a very low profile, going out at night to serve the Christian community. But when a dying Catholic in Chongqing needed the final sacrament during the day, Zhao Rong rushed to perform last rites. It was just his bad luck. He encountered a local bandit on the road who asked him if he was a follower of the foreign religion. Father Augustine answered honestly. He replied that he was both a Christian and a priest. The bandit reported this to the local magistrate. Of course, there was a reward, and Zhao Rong was arrested and taken to Chengdu, the provincial capital, where on January 27th, he underwent unpitying beatings and interrogations. He was ordered to apostatize, and when he refused to deny his faith, his face was beaten 80 times with a leather shoe. The old priest was nearly 70 years old, and his health was much too frail to endure this mistreatment. The torments he endured during his trials took a heavy toll on his weak body, and he died in his cell before the end of the year. Local Christians removed his body and solemnly buried his remains, and his grave became an important pilgrimage site for Chinese Catholics. Saint Thaddeus Liu Reiting was also martyred in Sichuan, though he died 8 years later during the reign of Emperor Daoguang. England had by then already begun selling opium in China, causing widespread addiction and badly battering China's economy. So it is somewhat understandable why Daoguang was suspicious of foreigners and the religion they brought with them. Unlike St. Jiaorong, Liu Reiting was born into a Catholic family, but he was raised in a very Buddhist context, which meant that he was part of a Christian minority that was always part of the village margins. His parents gave him the baptismal name Thaddeus, the apostle of Christ who suffered martyrdom by being beaten with a club and then beheaded at Persia. He was born in 1773, and after his parents had both died when he was only 20, Liu Reiting began studying Latin in preparation for formal seminary training. He was very well known for his personal piety and service to his church community, which he provided with gentleness and joy. Mother Teresa once said that true holiness consists of doing God's will with a smile. He was in this sense truly holy. Thaddeus Liu Reiting completed his seminary studies and was ordained by the French bishop Saint Gabriel Turenne de Fraisse in 1808. Father Liu's first assignment was to northeastern Sichuan, but his new ministry there was short-lived due to Emperor Daoguang's anti-Christian decrees. Not only were Christians under suspicion by the government, but common rumors were spread that foreigners were freakish monsters. At that time, there was a popular myth in China that Westerners were, underneath their clothing, large masses of hair. Foreigners were thus called Harries in Chinese, and Chinese who had converted to Christianity, a foreign religion, were referred to as second-hand Harries. Father Liu and other Chinese priests were in this second category, polluted by their new religious attachment to a foreign religion. Starting in 1817, local authorities began to arrest Chinese priests, and Thaddeus narrowly escaped being seized in 1819. By May 1st, 1820, 2 of his fellow Chinese priests had already been imprisoned for refusing to deny their Christian faith, and he himself was hiding at the home of a Christian named Zhao Changlin. Local Catholics had secretly gathered in Mr. Zhao's house to celebrate Pentecost. During this gathering, another Chinese man reported their whereabouts to the local authorities, who dispatched police to arrest the unaware Christians gathered for Holy Mass. As the court troops crashed through the door, Father Thaddeus turned in surprise. His reaction was misinterpreted by one of the policemen as an attempt at self-defense, and the guard thrust his spear into the priest's arm. The group of around 30 faithful were rounded up and delivered to the local court to face tribunals. They were fortunate that their first judge was, in fact, superstitious, because just before he asked the Christians his first question, the ceiling beam of the great hall cracked and fell. He believed this was a sign to avoid the usual tortures administered to prisoners. The judge did, however, order one of the court runners to wear Father Liu Reiting's priestly vestments while holding a communion wafer and a box of holy oils. The man was commanded to parade through a nearby street, while another beat a gong in front of him, announcing loudly, "Medicine extracted from the eyeballs," and "wafer from deluded believers. All of you do not believe in the Catholic religion." Being superstitious, the judge believed popular legends about Catholics. And one of them was that missionaries, Western missionaries, removed the eyeballs from Chinese people and turned them magically into silver. Thaddeus continued to be humiliated in various ways until he was transferred on December 12th to Chengdu, and again in 1821 to the city of Chuxian. The following year, the imperial order to execute Father Liu Reiting arrived from the emperor himself. The executions of Christians were never delayed. His jailers took him to the execution ground, where he was slowly strangled to death in a public spectacle. His executioner twisted a hempen cord around St. Liu Reiting's neck and tightened and released it 3 times. The final twist completely cut off his air supply, and he died. His body was taken and unceremoniously buried at Guanshan. Local Catholics later removed his remains and held a solemn Christian burial at another cemetery, which became a popular pilgrimage site. Both St. Jiaorong and St. Liu Reiting were martyred during a very complicated and unstable era of China's long history. England had begun its campaign of selling opium to the Chinese people, and the missionaries, who sometimes arrived on boats armed with large, imposing cannons, were often seen as agents of Western imperialism and drug sales. But what the Chinese authorities did not know was that the Western powers that brought guns and opium to China did so without the support of the missionaries who traveled with them. But history is often untidy, and this entire episode of China's history gave the church many martyrs. The era that followed the Opium Wars was even more anti-Christian. By 1898, Sino-Western tension reached a fevered peak, and by 1900, the Boxer uprising against foreigners and Christian missions resulted in the wholesale massacre of tens of thousands of Christians. In fact, one village of 3,000 Catholics was entirely massacred by imperial troops and Boxers. The final saint I'll discuss in this episode is one of the more compelling examples of a Chinese Catholic who died during the dreadful killings carried out during the summer months of 1900. This saint is the young Shi Zhuzi, who is all the more remarkable because he was martyred before his baptism. This is what the church calls a baptism of blood. Pope John Paul II made special mention of Saint Shi in his homily as he canonized the martyr saints of China on October 1st, 2000. The Holy Father said that Shi Zhuzi cried out fearlessly to the band of Boxers that had just cut off his right arm and were preparing to flay him alive. The saint said, "Every piece of my flesh and every drop of my blood will say to you, I am a Christian." He was being tortured because he had refused to reject Christianity and worship a statue in a close-by temple. Saint Shi Zhuzi was born into a non-Christian household in Hebei province in 1882, and his parents followed China's indigenous religious culture, which was eclectic. It was an admixture of Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. His parents were illiterate farmers, and so Saint Shi Zhuzi learned about the Christian faith orally from a nearby Catholic family. He attended Holy Mass on Sundays and feast days, though not without the disapproval of his parents. By 1899, local bands of young men began to form into Boxer units that trained in martial arts and made oaths to drive out foreigners and eliminate Christianity in the Middle Kingdom. Xi's parents were understandably frightened that their son's involvement with the Catholic mission would bring trouble to their household. They asked Shi Juzi to wait until anti-Christian hostilities had ended before returning to church. But he insisted on at least attending masses. And to discourage even this, his parents refused him food. Household tensions became heightened when Shi Juzi refused to make the traditional ritual sacrifices during the Lunar New Year. This was tantamount, in his family's view, to a denial of both his familial ties and his identity as a Chinese. Shi Juzi was expelled from his family and forced to live in the home of a Catholic family at another village. By June, northern China was teeming with fanatical Boxers who were killing Christians and destroying missions and foreign legations. Amidst these anxieties, Shi Juzi's parents called for him to return home. They told him that they would not obstruct his conversion to Christianity as soon as the violent incidents were over. So he left the home of his hosts to return home. His parents lived nearly 30 miles away. Providence took him very close to his destination when he was at last confronted by Boxers. They asked Shi if he was a Christian, and he responded that he was. It was common for Boxers, when they encountered a Christian, to take him or her to a nearby temple and give the poor person a chance to live by worshiping the resident deity. In this instance, Shi Juzi was ordered to make a ritual offering to the Buddhist Bodhisattva Guanyin, and he refused. The Boxers tried to force him to comply, but still, Shi would not apostatize. They dragged him into his home village, passing his parents' home, to torture him. And once they arrived to a public area, Shi Juzi knelt down and he drew a cross on the ground. Kneeling before the cross, he told his tormentors that he was prepared to die for God. One of the Boxers, named Yellow Tiger, cut off Shi's right arm with his sword, and it was at that moment that the young Christian made his famous affirmation, "You can proceed with your cutting. Go ahead and slice me to pieces," he said, "but each cut, each piece of my flesh, and each drop of my blood will tell you that I am a Christian." The Boxers attacked the kneeling man all at once with their swords and spears until he finally collapsed. He was only 18 when he died, and some might suggest that this was a wasted life. But in Christianity, we often see that when martyrs die, new converts are born. In this case, Shi Juzi's formerly anti-Christian parents asked for baptism when they heard the tragic news of their own son's death. As Tertullian has said, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. I began this episode with a note of disappointment that we have so few records of the lives of China's Chinese saints, and we should hope that future scholars work to uncover more information about them. China's Catholic martyrs cry to be heard by the entire church. The collective example of their fortitude when confronted with torture and death is astonishing. We could, for example, learn much from Saint Fan Hui, who, after being brutally cut by Boxer swords, faced her attackers and said, "Wait till I've finished my prayers, then you can kill me." And after she had completed her prayers, she looked again at her tormentors and said, "Okay, I'm finished. You can go ahead now." When Boxers gave Saint Wang Zuolong the chance to apostatize and live, he replied, "I cannot deny my faith. I want to go to heaven now." Or there is the example of Saint Ma Taishun, who similarly said to his killers, "I firmly believe in God, and if that's why you want to kill me, don't hesitate." In the Catholic Church, we believe that a saint is someone who we know for certain is in heaven. This is why we ask them for prayers. After all, the saints are now in the presence of God, who can do all things. I think that one of the signal marks of the Chinese martyr saints is their particular example of courage at the moment they faced their deaths. But their courage did not come from nowhere. It was fueled by an abiding faith that Christianity is true, that God exists, and that death is only the beginning of eternal happiness with the author of all creation. I think perhaps that C.S. Lewis had this in mind when he said that courage is not simply one of the virtues, but the form of every virtue at the testing point. China's Chinese saints have been tested, and their courage has given them the greatest reward of all.